Hello and welcome to Monarchist Unfiltered. I'm your host, McCosk, and these are our other hosts.
This is me, Bronze.
Me, I am.
And our first guest.
And I'm Ashen.
Ashen.
Then Bishina.
Yes.
Well,
Greetings. Nice
as Christ, having a guest really does changes things because I completely blanked right there. In any case,
probably an introduction would be good if you could tell us a little bit about yourself, Ashen.
Try not to dox yourself. This is still the internet.
Yeah, don't dox yourself. Just sort of, give us an aesthetic.
Yeah, absolutely. So, my name's Ashen. 26, American. Not too much information there, but I've had an interest in monarchism for several years, and I run a Discord, and I'm a moderator on the R Monarchism subreddit. So, I got a little bit of it's a little bit of a hot.
And we're glad to have you.
So I'm glad to be here, certainly.
It just hit me. We actually never introduced ourselves as well, but oh well.
It's okay. It's part of the kids would say the vibe.
Oh god.
Yeah. So today we've decided that we're going to be talking about succession crisis and more generally dynasty and the question of dynasty. Obviously, American being quite interested in the question of dynasty, America having never had a monarchy. So I think to begin we should start with succession crisis and the sort of importance of succession crises, what the sort of effects are. Obviously, McCosk, seeing as you have actually, you are Portuguese, so the Spanish have been having lots of succession crises, so I think you can probably at least have more insight than two people living in England.
And one American. Not to flex, but the base idea here is that succession crises are not, well, they are a general thing in so much as they have happened pretty much everywhere else. The issue is that they're unique in how they are solved and what causes them. A famous case, quite unique to Portuguese monarchist history, is that when we have a succession crisis, rather than go with the cadet branch, we go with the bastards. We straight up just pick up the nearest bastard and say, you're now the king. So yeah, in Portugal, being literally the bastard from nowhere is almost a qualifier to be a king. Our most famous dynasty, the House of Avis, was famously founded by a bastard of the main Burgundian dynasty, and the Bragantine dynasty was famously founded by a bastard of the Vizine dynasty. However, this is rather unique to the Portuguese scenario. In most European cases, succession crises were solved either by treaty or by appointing a cadet branch of the main house. Famously, this is the case of the French monarchy, who, until as late as the French Revolution, the House of Bourbon called itself the House of, Capet. No, it's the other way around. They called themselves the House of Bourbon, to the point that when the French revolutionaries came around, they refused to acknowledge essentially the noble law that created cadet branches and referred to as the last king as Louis Capet, even though he kept trying to correct them. No, my name is Bourbon.
That's pretty epic, not going to lie.
I mean, there's also another solution, which is rather an unfortunate one, which is war.
Yes, succession crises typically involve wars. I think most people are kind of aware of this. And to explain why that involves is that we have to explain how succession law works. Now, according to monarchist orthodoxy, in so much as such a thing can be said to exist, succession is instantaneous. In fact, a funny quip from an author whose name evades me right now, he said that succession is faster than light because it's supposedly instantaneous. Yeah, the moment the king dies, the next king is already king de facto, if not de jure, therefore beating the speed of light, supposedly, in the logic.
You mean he would be king de jure, if not de facto?
Yes, you're right. God, again. In any case, continuing, the core issue is that this is orthodoxy and not necessarily reality. In practice, succession law was a very convoluted affair that was only very rarely codified, and most of succession laws were only codified rather recently, say around the 17th centuries if you have early adopters, but for the most part, 1800s to, in some extreme cases, the 1900s. Generally speaking, each succession laws are a bit difficult to approach so generally, but I'm going to go on a limb and assume most of our listeners played CK2, because such is the state of internet monarchism, sadly. Not a bad base to start.
Not sadly. CK2 is a fucking great game.
Gloriously.
Continue.
No one is doubting that. I I don't know. Maybe I'm just a bloody boomer. Who knows? The base idea is simple. In Europe, the oh my god, I can't bloody believe I forgot the name of the law. Salic law, there you go, Salic law. Christ, I was about to have a gamer moment. The base idea is that Salic law dominated the European mindset, so much so that the Capetian dynasty, a popular name, and if you played CK2, I hope to God you know who the Capets are, was famous for pulling off the Capetian miracle, which was it had the longest succession of male primogeniture heirs in recorded history, beating, I think, the Chinese dynasties, if not in length, then in succession, I think. The base idea is that the Salic law was extremely influential the more north in Europe you go, largely because it was compiled, contrary to the name, by Charlemagne rather than the Salian Franks. Most of Charlemagne's capitularies were after the fact compilations of law, with some of them having a very Romanizing emphasis to them rather than being honest to tradition compilations of law. And it makes relatively little sense because most tribal Franks elected their monarchs. It was the Ripuarian Franks and the Franks that would eventually become the Merovingians that had hereditary succession as base. The Salians, I think, were at least, I think the closest thing we have is that they elected still with on the shield and all. But generally speaking, succession law is a complicated thing precisely because it often is dependent on who has the most troops, basically. If the heir what amounts to what in the earlier you go in time or the more recent you go in time, the successor to the king is often who managed to assure loyalty of the army. This is a very polite way to say that succession law is both extremely important in theory and some would say, I primarily would say psychologically, but in practice it has often been overruled. In fact, legitimism, and when I say legitimism as in the iron-handed belief that the succession law must be followed to the letter, this is I'm referring here to legitimism in the etymological sense of the word legitimism, not a direct reference to French legitimists, although they are obviously emblematic of this trend. Only really became a thing in the 17th centuries when, funnily enough, after the pedigree collapse, but magical thinking of nobility was at an all-time high. Because we have sufficient records that until roughly the 1600s, though really it only really died with the 1700s, it was actually common for monarchies to just jump the primary heir if he wasn't competent, if he had mental disabilities, if he had severe cases of health, or was just plain incompetent. Sometimes this didn't quite work out either way, a famous case being the Grand Duchy of Tuscany, whose last non-Habsburg duke, Gian Gaston, was the third in line that got jumped because the first heir was, well, an apoplectic guy who couldn't leave his bed. The second was mentally ill, and John Gaston, well, he was John Gaston. Hence why Tuscany was ruled by Habsburgs for, well, until it stopped existing as an independent state. The core issue here is that succession laws, and as I mentioned earlier, succession laws are not codified. So when one tries to change it, it's often very complicated, and we see a brilliant example of this in the Carlist Wars, where the monarchy, well, saying the monarchy did this is kind of a jump, but the succession law got changed to agnatic cognatic. Yeah, if there was no male heirs, the daughters could inherit. This understandably pissed off the Carlists, who supported the first cousin of the king, who under Salic law would be the heir. The core issue, especially with the Carlist Wars, but this is an undertone of almost all succession crises, that it's not only about who is going to be the king, because who the king is at the same time extremely important, at the same time is almost nigh on irrelevant, because what matters, especially in the more ancient historical section, is the institutions that surround them, and we see this very clearly in the Carlist Wars. While the Carlists, by and large, defended either a return to or the maintenance of what amounts to the Habsburgian-made fuero system, even if their claim it was of Bourbon, and you have the mainline Bourbons who defended, by that point, the centralized, liberal, slightly secularist Spanish reforms, though in practice they defended really the Nueva Planta decrees a century earlier, since the Nueva Planta decrees were never particularly well received anywhere. In fact, they were so poorly received they caused the Spanish colonial empire to fracture in the first place. So this is also the case in almost all contexts. A succession crisis is not only just a superficial, oh, I want to be heir or I don't want to be heir. It often has intense ideological undertones that often get misrepresented because, of course, you see this quite plainly in the dynastic struggles of China, especially with the fall of the first Chinese dynasty and the rise of... I can't believe I forgot the name. Wow, my social credit score has gone down by a lot.
Winnie the Pooh won't be pleased.
Oh boy, now we're banned in China. The base idea.
Well, that didn't
Go on, Ashen. I've been speaking far too long.
Oh, not at all. I was just, making a funny comment. But what's fascinating to me, and might be worth mentioning, is that succession crises, in the late Middle Ages, the Renaissance period, and so on, they became more and more, I guess, rare or unexpected as countries stabilized, unified under a ruling dynasty. But for example, in Saxon England, in the 10th or the 11th century, and even further back, you see that it's very rare that a monarch would pass the crown to his son, at least without some sort of pushback from the nobility, and that's just very fascinating to me that it's what we would call a succession crisis today is something more akin to the way the game is played when you go back into the early Middle Ages, when kingdoms were vying with other petty kingdoms, and the unified nations of Europe that we think of today were really broken up amongst
and different feudal possessions. It's funny that you mentioned this, because really back when the Anglo-Saxons, because until the Normans came in, Anglo-Saxon England followed primarily Germanic traditions of monarchy, in which the king had to be either elected, air quotes, very big air quotes, especially in the case of Anglo-Saxon England, or had to be approved by the assembly of the lords. So it's good that you mentioned it, because you also see this in some succession crises in England. While clearly not the case in War of the Roses. War of the Roses was the most pure and almost stereotypical example let's kill each other because this bloke is king and this other bloke wants to be king. It's although there were institutional discussions and trade and what have you underneath, it's kind of considered emblematic for all the wrong reasons, because it really isn't representative, but it is emblematic in the sense that it's almost pure, unadulterated. I want to be king, but the other guy is also king.
If anything, it is the Platonic ideal of succession crises.
Yes, a very self-deprecating conception of succession crises. But just to finish the Chinese example, the first dynasty was famously absurdly autocratic, to the point that, North Korea sounds democratic by comparison. Every dynasty that followed pretty much bad-mouthed it, to a later aggressive or lesser degree, the first dynasty. I mean, it wasn't as bad as the tyrant of Shang, the last ruler of the Shang dynasty, which wasn't an imperial dynasty, it was a kingly one, but still, some of the things he did was fucking wild. So in China, you have
Wasn't he the one who quote unquote lost his mandate of heaven by feasting on the corpses of his enemies?
Not only that, but he also made lakes of wine and islands of bacon. I don't know if it was actually bacon, but it was meat.
I wouldn't be surprised if it was bacon, because in a lot of history, of course, bacon was the ever-present pork, seeing as, of course, there was no refrigeration, so almost all meat was some form of bacon, as it had to be salted, dried, or smoked in some way to be preserved.
Eat your heart out, Americans. China beat you to the bacon craze. I say while we have a American in chat, and now I feel bad for being rude.
Well, everyone beat them to it. I mean, the bacon craze that exists now really began in the 1980s, with the pork board trying to market the fatter cuts of pork, as the 80s were the height of the low-fat movement. And so they had a very hard time selling fattier cuts of the pig, and that's why they started very heavily marketing bacon. And that's why the bacon craze that exists today.
That's very interesting, but not
related to the topic at all.
I wanted to say that because it's interesting.
Well, it is. I think also with succession crisis, as you pointed out about bastards and whatnot, it is interesting to consider the fact that in various different places you do have different rules on, or sort of rules in an informal sense, on like who should take over by default. And oftentimes, say in Spain or in Iberia, from what I know, that's generally bastards, as you say, rather than alternate lineages. Whereas in the sort of Britain has generally been quite against bastardy. It's one of the reasons why Duke Monmouth's rebellion failed, though that was also timing. And I think overall you also see, say, in places like Middle East, complete ban there, but that's also because polygamy is a thing, so it's less likely that you have it. And generally speaking, there is like quite different rules for different areas, and it's more even as you get into the modern day that you start seeing hard bans on bastards becoming rulers in at least Western Europe, but that's also largely because of the influence of things like parliaments, legislatures wanting to impose control over the monarchy, and so supporting often weaker candidates against stronger candidates so as to have more leverage over them, basically, which is what you see, say, in like the Carlist Wars, where there is this kind of interplay and constitutionalism, liberalism, all these sort of ideas that come in.
Yeah, it's funny that you mentioned, because especially, and I think we've all have dealt with this, the infamous question of what if the prince is dumb, inbred, or retarded? What happens then? Will we just be doomed to bear 40 years of a dumb, retarded prince? Well, historically and most modern day, unless the constitution is really that rigged against the monarchy, which can be the case, those princes get excluded from the line of succession, or just jumped in succession. Historically, most of the times the king just nominated a different successor from amongst their sons. Legitimism, as in this belief that the firstborn son or daughter in countries with cognatic succession was more accepted, which weren't that many in hindsight. It was always very important, because as time went on, and especially as the ideology evolved, and this is kind of something I have against CK2 being a primary tool from which many people come into contact with monarchism, to my endless shame, is that monarchism makes it seem so that dynasties were a thing from way too damn early. Because and to tie back to what Ashen was saying about how the states consolidated and how succession crises became rarer and rarer still, a lot of that is related to ideology, in a way. To use the term ideology is perhaps using too modern a term to it, especially because this ideology was for limited consumption, for the nobles, and only in extremely rare cases for the commoners. Though stuff like the heraldic emblems of the War of the Roses are perhaps an example of this, though that's more of propaganda than, say, ideology. But still, is that you had a kind of mystification of the idea of the dynasty. This was something that only started relatively late in the medieval ages, though there were some cases where it started much earlier. A good example of this is famously the Habsburgs at one point claimed to be descendant from, and I quote, Julius Caesar, Augustus, Charlemagne, a couple of saints, and somehow via what I can only imagine would have been black magic, the Babenbergs, the dynasty they succeeded, to which they were at best tangentially related.
I mean, I think the other thing that you see in terms of outside of Western Europe, there is, especially I think the big one we can compare here is the Middle East, where there is very, very strong identification with dynasty, to the point that it's like you rename states basically for losing a dynasty, and or even again, sort of China would be an obvious example, where they do have this stronger identification with dynasty, though China again is a different case. I think one of the reasons as well for this is the way in which sort of Europe developed, and how, as society became more organized and more centralized, specifically, there is this move towards having dynasty as like the unifying thing, that not simply that like there is a king of France and that you are loyal to him, but that there is the Bourbons, or the House of Plantagenet, from which these various kings derive their legitimacy, so that you, rather than sort of having any kind of legitimacy with the people themselves, the legitimacy is in, or more relevantly, land, whatever, being where you derive your kingship from. It's rather a move towards saying that the dynasty itself is somehow semi-divine, which itself played on prior things, and it often played into making kings saints. It often played into
I mean, you have the famous wood carving, and I forget which Austrian church it is, but it's quite a sight to see, in which Maximilian, I can't remember which one of the early ones, and in this wood carving, he has displayed the 40 saints of the House of Habsburg.
Yeah, and it's because it's a important point that when you dynasty sort of as a thing developed with the sort of increasing centralization that you get as Europe's economy, politics, and law develop, and that identification plays on previous things, be that sainthood, be that the royal touch, and so forth. But yeah,
also known as Leon Hans for the odd monarchist who's also a D&D player.
Who's played Paladin in World of Warcraft.
Oh yeah. Ashen, you are right there with Edward the Confessor's canonization is an important one.
Yeah, that was an early one, because William, as I'm sure you all know, William the Conqueror and his Normans, after the Battle of Hastings, they had secured, quote unquote, William's claim to the throne, but they still found the Saxons very, very difficult to manage and subjugate, and they saw that the church canonized Edward the Confessor, and I've seen in some sources that some consider his cause for canonization dubious. Not that he wasn't, perhaps a good man or something like that, but that he may not have been everything that the monks and the 11th century church played him up to be, but rather they were, coerced to do that by the Norman kings to solidify the legitimacy of William the Conqueror and his descendants' claim, insofar that he became the actual patron saint of the English monarchy for several centuries, or at least until the Crusades, when the cult of Saint George,
and later in Portugal, funnily enough.
In the most famous piece of Norman propaganda, the Bayeux Tapestry, at the very beginning, you can see the coronation of Edward the Confessor, and it is embroidered that the hand of God comes down from heaven and places the crown upon Edward's head.
Fun fact: tapestries were, until the printing press, the main way of how royal propaganda was dispensed. One of the other Maximilian, the later one, not the Mexican one, the one that was both King of Spain and Holy Roman Emperor, famously carried about a gargantuan tapestry of what amounts to the entire genealogy of the House of Habsburg around, and just kept putting it over and everywhere else. Has a kind of propaganda. In fact, the evolution of royal propaganda and ideology as a thing, leading up to its peak under absolutism, is a topic in of itself that we will one day discuss in an episode.
I mean, especially if we discuss the House of Habsburg, who were masters of propaganda.
Hey, good PR saves blood and keeps many a crown.
The quote really should be modified. Well, the world makes war. You, happy Austria, make wood carvings.
Those are some damn fine wood carvings, though.
They really are. I think it's in Innsbruck, the church with you should go see it anyway. It's really, really, really breathtaking.
At this rate, we'll become the Austrian tourist agency if they're willing to sponsor us. But back to topic.
Them and Raid Shadow Legends.
How hard can we not sell out? The answer is not hard enough.
Yeah, so this is an official shout out to Raid Shadow Legends and the Austrian Tourism Board, and I think for good measure, the House of Habsburg, whatever marketing division that they have. Hit us up, basically.
We're down. We're down to shill for the Habsburgs. There's no shame in that.
Absolutely. I've always been a great fan of Archduke Edward von Habsburg. I believe he's the
He is
ambassador to
the
the EU,
ambassador to the Holy See
glorified
from
post there. He's a great
Hungary.
guy.
Sorry, what was that, Bronze?
Edward Habsburg is the ambassador to the Holy See from Hungary.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I mean that's actually a fairly.
And if he wants to come on the show, he can. This is a public invite to Edward Habsburg to come on the show.
Epic.
Yeah, it would be fucking wild, not gonna lie. It would actually be interesting because we could ask him about Otto, who in his role in the Pan-European Council and his criticisms of legitimism as a whole. Since he did, it was years ago, and of all places, I read it on All Monarchism, but years ago, they posted a Otto's text criticizing legitimism. Not specifically the French faction that supports the House of Bourbon, but the whole shebang of
Legitimism in abstract.
Yeah, legitimism in abstract, the fanaticism of the succession law, and kind of naive absolutism, to not use a harsher word, which was very good. It criticized it on a basis of natural law. If you can find that document, I recommend it to read because it's genuinely a pleasure. Archduke Otto was a very good writer. But to go back to the topic, so as we've established, the succession law started to become increasingly important as the mythification and increasing identification of the state with dynasty started to become more of a thing in Europe, and this was a process that started from dynasties being barely a thing in the low, high, and almost the entirety of the late medieval ages to really became starting as a thing in the Renaissance, and then going onwards to the high point of French absolutism. I am the state, basically, and by extension, my dynasty is the continuation of the French state.
Yeah, I think, and so this is, I think, where you then get into an interesting question, because now that we have developed this idea of dynasty, and it sort of became quite strong, you then get the sort of American revolutions and the French Revolution, wherein we move from this identification of the people with a dynasty to the identification of a group of people with a state, and various forms of nationalism. And it seems to me that sort of, especially with most monarchists now, there's a serious contradiction, basically, because in most places the sort of line of succession has completely sort of become mixed, convoluted, dispersed, or in obvious cases like the US simply doesn't exist. Important examples of this would be Russia, Germany,
India in general, though there are some quite notable particular exemptions. Many of the former dynasties of the princely state still hold in surprisingly important social functions. One wouldn't expect they did, but they actually do, especially in the South. Fun fact, especially for the CK2 players out there, and for anyone keeping track, the Pandya dynasty of southern India still exists. Like to remind you, for anyone who's keeping score, they still have the Yamato beat by at least 600 years.
I would like to take a quick moment to say, Paradox, do reach out, for we are open.
Yeah, I have actually
and desperate.
I have actually met Indian royalty. I think, yeah, he was a prince, and the interesting point basically that he made to me was that the the big reason why a lot of these people still have social function is because India as a whole is still very feudal. Most politics is basically feudal, and these kings are usually very rich landowners, hence they have a lot of social function, which is a thing that we often forget about India, is that it is basically still feudal, semi-feudal, which is one of the things actually that Modi is attempting to change. But Ashen, I think you want to say something?
Well, no, not really, but I do. I can come up with something real quick. I was thinking that, while we're talking about succession crises and so on, there are two great events in history. We already touched on one, which was the Wars of the Roses, and that in itself could be enough material for several shows. But as far as propaganda goes, we see multiple instances of the opposed royal houses of Lancaster and York using propaganda against one another to devastating effect, especially, for example, Richard III. He discredited the blood rights or the claims of the princes in the Tower, the sons of Edward IV, and to the point where once they had quote unquote disappeared, not blaming him by the way, the jury's still out on what happened to them. He could kind of, even though it really devastated his support among his nobility, he was still king, and he could still summon a massive army to defend him from Henry Tudor when he landed, simply because he had discredited them by accusing Edward IV, who was well known for his improprieties and dalliances, of fathering them, of them being bastards rather than legitimate sons. So it's very interesting to observe how even hundreds of years ago, this propaganda was being used to discredit someone else's claim, bolster your claim, and see successions that, again, with the succession laws, the order of succession that we've discussed already and earlier in the episode, should not have been possible. And Edward
I mean,
III's
Richard III.
succession was one of those, definitely.
Richard III is a
I'm sorry,
great
Richard III.
example of propaganda, because, of course, not only did he use propaganda, but he, mostly posthumously, was greatly maligned by propaganda. This, especially in Shakespeare, you have this depiction of him as this hunchbacked, craven, cruel man who killed the princes in the Tower.
I mean,
Yeah, and obviously my or my kingdom for a horse, and that whole line. It was, I think, one of the things that helped destroy him, basically, posthumously.
And an even bigger example is perhaps not so obviously ill-intended, but nonetheless important, is the Chinese practice of compiling the official history of the previous dynasty once the new dynasty comes into power. Famously, not all dynasties were blessed by this, especially if they were particularly short-lived. Shout-outs to the Shun dynasty. This too was a kind of propaganda, although a bit harder to get by now sense, but since there was an official story composed of that dynasty, it kind of meant that they were history, air quotes. Even though I think the Qing were already writing the official history of the dynasty, even when you had that Ming holdout in Taiwan. So some things are eternal, it seems. The continent-Taiwan tension. And my social credit is probably rock bottom at this point.
I mean, there is the saying, geography never changes, which, though geologists will contest that statement, on the timescale in which humans exist, it's very true. As there are sort of geographic conditions that will repeat themselves in history.
Fair enough. I would also like to recommend to the whatever world representation organ of geologists there exists that they sue Bethesda to hell and back for the quote then.
Indeed.
I mean, you can't do. I mean, at least that would be a slight upscale for the Fallout games, but less games, more history and monarchism. Yes, propaganda, especially in the way that it molded the perception of the state by what as time went on was the nobility and the gentry, and really people who were able to participate in politics at any level. So we can also include the merchant classes and the early bourgeoisie. Was what really marked the perception of the state in the West. And a thing we must explain, especially when talking to monarchism, is as time went on, the increasing surrealistic prevalence of magical thinking. And some cases of magical thinking went to high levels of like, what and why and how did you get here after the pedigree collapse of the 1600s? A very good example I remember is there is a quote about two Russian nobles discussing what separates them from a Russian peasant, and their glorious argument was, and I quote, "Oh, we are white in the bone and peasants have black bones." So yes, feudalism in I suppose Russian nobility apparently made your bones white. Such was the magical thinking at the time. You have
Indeed, and there's always the blue blood, moniker that the aristocracy began to be associated with. I can't recall the actual, reasoning or mythology behind that term, but
it's fairly simple.
People really did believe
people
that,
who, especially in agricultural settings, but this was really a thing that developed more in the sunnier parts of Europe, so before the Little Ice Age. Basically, a farmhand would eventually get tan from working under the sun, and you could not see, especially in the pulse, particularly the blue veins that cross. Especially very pale people, you can see them quite clearly. Sometimes even on the upper on the outside and the inside of the hands in some extreme cases. Since most of the nobility either were armor or had the glorious invention of having long sleeved shirts,
or spending all their time indoors because they didn't have to work in the field,
meant that they in general had very light skin, meaning that, well, when you looked at their hands, you could see the blue veins, hence blue blood.
And of course, this culminated in the 18th century when well-to-do aristocrats would exaggerate this effect by applying white powder to seem paler and painting on veins with I forget the name of the substance, but essentially it's blue makeup to paint on veins.
Yes, magical thinking magical thinking is ultimately the bane of all ideologies, since what separates an ideology from what amounts to a very complicated set of magical thinking is its effect, is if it's still receiving inputs from reality or not. So while monarchism's case of magical thinking might be in hindsight more humiliating and hilarious, they are historically not as mind-bogglingly murderous and deadly as the other cases of magical thinking. Soviet Union, Nazi Germany, yeah. Oh God. The
Mouse China.
Yeah. I would say, and the fascinating thing about the magical thing that you mentioned, that the superstition, the mystique that surrounds the institution and tradition of monarchy is it seems to inundate and shield the royalty, the aristocracy from let's say critical thought. And you see that the monarchs, they invent these legends and these mythologies and things like that to keep the institution elevated, because you see, when it's torn down, when it's shorn of its smoke and mirrors, if you will, I don't mean that in a disrespectful way, but when it's torn down to a human level and exposed, it begins to crumble quite fast. Actually, if you look at the modern monarchies of today, so I can see why these royals spent so many centuries and so much effort.
Every ruling elite does this. Even today, you see this with the nowadays not believed, but the senatorial stereotype that nowadays is a bit fallen out of place, but by elected representatives, how they sometimes try to claim up this image of ancient Rome of being these generally elevated, well-educated, and this kind of, again, senatorial stereotypes some elected representatives seem to claim. Every single ruling elite does this to a lesser or greater degree. Like you had Nazi Germany portraying itself as being pure-blooded Aryan stock, and an extremely hilarious claim, especially when applied to Adolf Hitler. That you also had this particularly with Maoist China, though it was more related to following or not the dictates of Mao. And communism in general, you have this kind of cult of personality being a very concrete example of this self-mythification. It's natural, and in generally speaking, it's kind of required, as you implied. The issue is when it starts actually contributing to your downfall. And the most infamous case of magical thinking, I don't know if this was more universal in other aristocracies, but with the Portuguese aristocracy, especially until like the 1800s, maybe a bit earlier with the Marquis de Pombal, but the nobles went with what I can only say is rocket science logic. Knowing how to read is peasant and makes you not noble. Therefore, the true noble does not know how to read or write. He hires staff to do so. And understandably, this did not actually contribute that much to the aristocracy as an institution surviving. Some aristocracies either didn't buy this viewpoint, a famous case being the Junkers of Germany. The Spanish aristocracy was different due to how feudalism had evolved and the college question, but there was a mix of both ideas. The Portuguese aristocracy went hog wild on this. What do you mean a noble has to know how to read and write? What? I don't know how to read and write. Neither have the 3 generations before me, nor will all the next after me. Thankfully, we got better.
I mean, there are some surprisingly late examples of this kind of thinking. I mean, a famous one is the tutor to Nicholas II of Russia saying, "I don't need to teach him anything because all the knowledge that he needs to rule properly will be put into him by the sacrament of coronation."
Poetic, but holy shit.
Would that I had that much faith in the power of the sacraments and the rites of the church, which I do, by the way.
It's certainly aspirational.
Yes, that's definitely a very, very devout.
I mean, in one hand, he did have a point. Like if we see some of the justifications that Nicholas II used for some of his actions, they do sound extremely Russian in character and in pathos, especially. What with "I don't think I should betray my dynasty" and a betrayal of the dynasty. And the Romanovs famously were, well, to Western eyes perhaps not that evident, but the Romanovs were heavily mythologized, like to the point that now that the dynasty has fallen, the Romanovs are mythologized by Westerners more than they are by Russian monarchists proper. Like to the Western audience, the Romanov has this kind of aura that surrounds them of the iron-fisted autocrat with an iron will to see things done. Well, in truth, that was not necessarily always the case, and in fact was a depressingly short amount of the cases, with their most iron-willed monarchs being famously their most liberal ones. But comments about the Russian monarchy aside, yeah, this kind of magical thinking did not contribute to the nobility surviving, but again, it was not universal. Typically, the French aristocracy had it worse because And indeed, the conditions of the French aristocracy are very interesting, because where the mythologizing got at the strongest was where, funnily enough, the nobility got at its poorest. The French nobility, despite what the listener may think, was, by the time of the French Revolution, nigh on penniless. Like, we are talking, they were broker than the average peasant, nearly, in terms of liquidity. Not in terms of absolute value, but in terms of liquidity, some of them were complete flat broke, to the point that really they were just keeping their stuff because it wasn't taxed.
But that was in part because why the revolution ended up happening was because the lesser nobility and sort of bourgeoisie, in the sort of proper formal sense, basically abandon the monarchy in favor of constitutional monarchy. Then sort of one thing leads to another, because also the actual event of constitutional monarchy, almost the first thing that they do is a mass privatization, wherein large quantities of land are sold off at auction. And then obviously, basically, it's like one thing leads to another.
The famous Biens Nationaux. I know that's not how I pronounce it, but consider this a back at you for dumb aristocratic stuff from France. But another thing that we have to understand, especially when touching with the French aristocracy, was how long-term they were screwed. Because a lot of people think, Versailles was this place of glory, prestige, where the high and mighty were. It was a cage. It was literally a cage. Nobles were effectively forced to spend their 6 months of the year in a system that in a parallel development of what would later be developed in the Tokugawa shogunate much later. They had a specific name, but it essentially meant that the heads of each province had to be 6 months in the shogunal capital, and then back, and the other 6 months in their homes. But in Versailles, especially during the heyday of Versailles, the nobility had to effectively be locked in the Versailles, which led to, and one of the main contributing cases of the French Revolution, mass absentee landlordism, to the point that essentially the regions that would later arise against the Republic, namely the Vendée and Brittany in general and in particular, I suppose, were the areas where famously the aristocracy said, no, I like Bretagne and I'm not going to Versailles.
Well, also, I can't afford the fare to get there and back again.
Yes, it was absurdly expensive, largely because the king fixed prices. And this is a lot of things that we have to understand, especially when talking to this quote-unquote decline of the aristocracy, is that a lot of it was engineered by the monarch to solidify his position. A very hilarious case comes from Portuguese calling it legislation is a bit too strong a word, but these were sort of guidelines to what it meant to be a noble. And we have two extremely contrasting examples. One from the 15th century and one from the 1700s. And the one from the 15th century, with the full tone of the sumptuary laws embedded, is that the noble has to be frugal, has to be cautious, and has to think ahead, and has to spend as little as possible and be willing to give to others. The 16th century goes like this. The noble must show their stately and exalted bearing by wearing the finest silks, the finest dresses, and essentially just bankrupt themselves on money so that they would be dependent on the king for loans and straight up wages. Now the reader might think, well, why didn't they get a job? Because they couldn't. And this was kind of another contributing factor to the decline of many European aristocracies, though again, it was not necessarily universal, was that the nobility was banned from having jobs. I shit you not. If you had a noble, if you were a noble and had something as quaint as being the owner of a hotel, because back then hotels were basically whorehouses, but with a slightly nicer makeup, there goes your nobility and all your private property. Having a job was actually a death sentence for the majority of nobility that either had to get its money from typical aristocratic ventures, landowning, mineral rights, or service to the state. And as absolutism came into play, service to the state started to become kind of desperately necessary for a lot of them to continue existing.
Yeah, and on the topic of French aristocracy, it's interesting that you mention how they were pretty much, in the reign of Louis XVI, they'd abandoned the monarchy, or in some ways stonewalled king when he attempted to make reforms. They had grown much too powerful since the reign of Louis XIV. Of course, that all their ascension and power was enabled by the failures of Louis XV. But it's interesting that in the late medieval period, the Renaissance period, even the early Baroque period of the French monarchy, the powers of the nobility almost swung like a pendulum. When Louis XIII died and 14 ascended, he was, you probably know, during the Fronde, he was driven out of Paris with cannons at his back as a child. And, that was, the nobility dominating the king, basically. And after he returned after several years, he was incensed at that. And that's really what drove him to construct Versailles and corral all the nobles that he did not trust directly under his thumb. So it's fascinating that you go from that to within, just a few decades, the reign of Louis XVI, where the nobles have wrested back their power, and the king can't manage them, and it gets to the point where he pays the ultimate price for failing to secure power over a runaway aristocracy.
Yeah, another base idea, especially with the French Revolution, is that the vast majority of the nobility simply did not actually. Well, the vast majority is perhaps giving them too much credit, but significant portions of the aristocracy during the French Revolution genuinely had nothing left to give. Like, if you abolish their privileges, or in many cases just made them pay tax, they would have gone destitute the day the tax collector arrived. Like, it was a complicated scenario, though I'm not going to deny that there were, in fact, obscenely rich nobles that just didn't want to pay tax because they were that much of an asshole, and laughed at the poverty of the people, etc. That stereotype has a kernel of truth, but let's not forget, these aristocrats were also human, and they also had their own issues to deal with.
I think the nobles that were very rich are remembered more because they're written more about, because they could go to Versailles and put on the big show, and so they're written about and remembered. While no one's going to remember the poor baron in the Vendée who tries not to freeze to death trying to heat his crumbling chateau,
and how they're even tricely forgotten because when the peasants were rebelling against the Republic, they walked up to his mansion and demanded that he lead them. And, well, he had to do what he didn't have any particular training, though with all things considered, spectacularly successful results, even if they later did get killed. But yes, from succession to the particulates of French aristocracy, though I do think it's all connected, since all this came about and was really only possible due to the magical thinking that started surrounding dynasties and noble houses. Now that we talked about the negatives, I think we can go to a brief overview of the positives of this, especially to perhaps the more republicanly inclined viewer we may or may not have, of why this was a positive thing. We already mentioned that it deflected potential succession crises and uprisings, because if you believe that the dynasty is divinely ordained, has a mystical power, or whatever, you are less inclined to rebel against the dynasty. But more to the point is that it gave a sense of collective identity to in this case, not only the dynasty, but also the noble house. And much like we have, how nations are supposed to give people a collective identity, we now have, now how nations are supposed to do that. But back then, the dynasty gave the major state actors, especially those within the dynasty, but also those underneath it, a kind of shared backing from which to organize themselves. Hence, the noble house and the royal house, because of this collective identity, were often able to outplay others by sheer organization. A very, very shining example of this is the Habsburg dynasty. Again, we're ready for the partnership, Habsburgs. Just dial us up.
Yeah, I think the big benefit that we can sort of see with dynasty, that you would see, say, I think a very good comparison is the Romanovs versus or Russia, sorry, versus the Byzantines, where the Romanovs rule for 300 years, the Rurikids prior to them rule for even longer, depending on how accurately you take claims to legacy. Whereas in the Byzantines, there's sort of a civil war every 10 years, whatever. There will civil war pretty much every time someone dies, or a coup, or some kind of.
There's an asterisk between each swap of emperor.
Yeah, and that did historically have serious impact on the stability of the Byzantine state, as sort of anyone can realize.
Yeah, I've heard some pretty woke takes on that. With some saying it was the fact that the Byzantines never recognized the succession law, which was a plague that also plagued the Roman Empire. Another thing is that, and this is the woke one, is that that's natural for places around Anatolia. Look at the Ottoman Empire and its civil wars decreed by succession law. For centuries, it was literally whoever kills the other heirs is now king, basically. Or in this case,
yeah, until I think it was Murad who came up with the great idea of the cage, which is going to stick all the heirs into this palace. They're gonna have a bunch of servants, and all the servants will be deaf mute.
Epic.
But they're going to have a lot of concubines. But if they get, if any of them become pregnant, and that would complicate things, so that those will be drowned. And when the Sultan dies, we're going to pick one of the children out from the cage, and then kill all the rest. And this is a system that was also copied by the Mughal Empire.
And by MBS, Mohammed bin Salman, he's done this. He's thrown all of his uncles and nephews and whatnot into, I think, the Hilton in Mecca or Rida.
It's a cage, all right.
And yeah, I mean, they get to sit there and abuse their Filipino maids, and they don't bother anyone.
If you're a Filipino, do not go for Saudi Arabia, ever. For the love of everything you hold sacred, do not go to Saudi Arabia. Do not.
Yeah, I mean, but so the other thing I'd point out here,
the problem
with
the Ottoman cage was that on occasion it sent them a bit barking mad.
Well, yeah, I mean, there's that clear issue. The point, I think, which is more interesting about the Ottomans and the Byzantines is that in many ways the Ottoman state was far more Byzantine than it was Muslim. There's greater continuity almost between how the Ottomans, the Sublime Porte, ran themselves and the Byzantines than there was between Muslim dynasties or like Arabic Turkic dynasties and the Ottomans. And I mean that's kind of to be inevitable. Like all of them were ethnically Greek. All of them were sort of, I mean, several times they married Byzantine princesses. At other points there were various kinds of copying of bureaucracy and whatnot by the by the Ottomans.
I mean, a very good example is when the Sultan that conquered Constantinople, something the Magnificent. Boy, I'm really on my A game today.
Selim II.
Yeah, Suleiman the Magnificent. Yeah, he was ethnically Greek and related to like Constantine, whatever.
Yeah, when he conquered Constantinople and he sat on the throne of the Byzantine empires, he literally proclaimed, "I am now successor of Rome." Which, if for all those keeping score at home of how many Romes there are, if you count the Ottoman claim, there are now 6 Romes, all of them existing in their own special way in our hearts.
Is that counting the Gambian Rome?
That's also counting the Gambian Rome.
I mean,
Okay.
yeah, and it's sort of to move back to this question of dynasty in general, like what you do, I mean, even with the Ottomans, what you do see with them compared to Byzantines is far greater power. I mean, on a basic level, what the Ottomans had accomplished was the unification of Greece and Anatolia, and then having some measure of succession wherein you don't get civil wars. Those two things together, plus complete hard block to Venice and all that bullshit, secured for them like domination over most of Europe, and the Middle East. I mean, they were the big power. They had continuity of genetic, they had continuity of bureaucracy, they had continuity to a certain degree of ideology, and I mean they have continuity of religion to a certain degree in that their form of Islam was Caesaro-Papist. So there's no, and this is I think an important point, that there is no significant difference actually between the organization of the early Ottoman state and the Byzantines. The only significant difference might be the Janissaries, but that, I mean, it seems to me that that's kind of a strange thing to point out. Rather, what it seems to me basically is that they achieved what the Byzantines had failed to do for a very long time, which was control Anatolia and Greece. And with that, and then like not having civil wars, they just dominate like from Egypt up to Hungary. I mean, it's quite impressive what they were able to do with just not having civil wars, even if it's basically just coups.
Yeah. Another thing is that the Byzantines also had, the Byzantines had an issue that they were so centralized that it was fairly easy to just seize control of large sections of the army and then just through sheer incompetence kill them off. In the Ottoman Empire, for the longest time, until this started to become a problem, it was rather difficult to mobilize the entire army for a civil war due to a number of reasons we won't go into detail here. So the damage of these civil wars was also comparatively less. Well, these coups was also comparatively less than the previous Byzantines one was, until they actually started to be as damaging. That's when they were eventually abolished. The succession law was solidified, to use a better word.
I mean, the most famous example of these Byzantine coups might be Justin, father to Justinian, who sort of just by being the emperor's personal guard sort of stumbled onto the purple, as it were.
I mean, you also have like Byzantine history is hilarious, and I would like to point out is the first historical evidence of football hooliganism destroying a state. Never forget the Nickel riots. One day I will be alive to see a soccer match just overthrow a country. Just mark my words. We will live in an age where that will happen.
Also, this podcast officially supports the blue faction.
Anyone who supports the Reds, the Whites, is dead. We will send the retroactive red blue team death squads after you. Everyone knows blue only wins those chariot races. If the
Wasn't it green? Who was the main rival to blue?
Oh, they had various teams at various times.
Yeah. So blue is eternal. All others are temporary. Never forget.
Well, I mean, also they stopped having that. So, I mean, imagine like football hooliganism, sort of seriously like imagine sort of Arsenal v I don't know what other London football clubs are there? I don't even know football clubs.
Wow, we're really outing ourselves as social outcasts, aren't we?
No, I watch rugby. Like, so
Does snooker count?
I mean, snooker's more English than football, I think. But that is kind of irrelevant to the point here. That it's like,
I mean, the classic London hooligan club is Millwall.
yeah. So
Millwall storms Westminster.
Yeah, Millwall storms Westminster. I mean, that's like, I mean that is kind of the level that
Base?
the level of base that the Byzantines were at. But I think the Ottomans versus the Byzantines is a very clear example of where dynasty has like an actual clear benefit, because I mean, it's sort of like it's not like the Ottomans were somehow like magically more competent than the Byzantines. I mean, it was just a case of they reformed the bureaucracy, basic sort of post-Roman, post-Byzantine bureaucracy, and united Anatolia and didn't have civil wars. And like, I think that's a clear sort of benefit to this, and it's. I think also this has to do with how a lot of the time dynasty is essentially just a form of like unified state structure, basically. I mean, if you look at, say, France, where you do have strong, France and Austria, I think, are good examples where you do have this strong sense of dynasty. It's a very simple case that they dominate everyone around them, and I think it's an interesting question of now that we've gotten to this stage wherein we now basically just have the state again with monarchs attached, or in case thereof, the degree to which, especially sort of specific successions, should monarchism be dedicated to that? And I think, obviously, America's a very clear example. And I think you see a lot of people who have very strange ideas, I think, about like who should be the American monarch. Some, like, obviously there's people who say, oh, Washington or like a founder or something should be, or like some kind of blood lineage. And it that kind of attitude, I think, misses almost the point of what dynasty functions to achieve, which is continuity of state, basically.
I mean, fundamentally speaking, what the concept of dynasty does is that when the ruler dies, in every sort of influential person's mind, there is an equation that happens. Should I continue to support the existing order, or should I do something else? And dynasty sort of slides the equation towards the supporting the continuing of the current order, because there is a thread throughout the statesmanship that goes with the dynasty. And so that makes dynastic rule more stable. And so there are crises less often, but they are more noticeable, because something really dramatic has to happen to create a sort of a break in the thread. Because if we go back to, as Ashen pointed out, the early medieval period, there were sort of small rows over succession nearly every single time the ruler died. And so you can't really talk about a succession crisis being this big, massive thing like the Wars of the Roses, because they happen so often. So I mean, but later we remember succession crises more often. But of course, there were overall less of them because there is this thread binding the statesmanship together, creating this continuity.
The dynasty and the primogeniture and so on and so forth, it incentivizes loyalty to the ruling family, because you see, like you said, in the early medieval period, as soon as the king died, or even beforehand, as soon as he caught a cold or the flu, you had nobles and barons making their preparations for some sort of raising their banners and marching on the capital and that sort of thing. But when you have the dynasty, the people, let's say the high lords, the dukes and the counts and so forth, the earls, they have built up their I guess their status and made themselves visible men of the former king. And when he passes, it's a much better gamble, as you were, like you said, it slides the equation and makes the option of loyalty to the dynasty or the ruling family much more palatable, because you have these privileges and your status and your accolades, your titles you've been awarded, your lands and holdings and things like that. And why would you want to risk that for a shot at the throne, or putting your man on the throne, when you could just as easily, if he lose everything and head to the block? So it's easy to see how dynasties and things like that became so ubiquitous in monarchy, because it's just no matter what way you slice it, it's just a much better system than having a
Yeah,
toss up
to
every time
really
someone
hammer in
kicks
the
the bucket.
point is that, and well, largely all that we talked about is why many early monarchists, or many early reactionaries, and well, depending on where you look at, many currently existing reactionaries are also against nationalism, because nationalism slides the equation the other way. Why be loyal to the dynasty when the nation is what is important? So, and some monarchists, well, low key, this is kind of a dividing issue in modern day monarchism, both in real life and in the internet, because, well, we have to make that separation. It is the internet after all. And on the issue of nationalism, because you clearly see with examples with like the Romanov Empire, the Ottoman Empire to a lesser degree, and many dynasties, and well, especially with the Bourbons, of how being loyal to the dynasty allowed you to be your own thing, hence why Occitans and Bretagnans, and other minorities of France were not forced to become French because of the nation.
Alsatians is the other one.
Yeah.
Sauvegards, whatever. Yeah, and you also see this actually in colonies. Actually, the Spanish were more pro Native American than the republics that succeed them.
Yeah, the entire question of, if, like, some younger monarchists often balk at the notion of why would a fellow monarchist be opposed to the notion of nationalism, in both in abstract and in concrete, often comes back to this underlying logic. If the nation is what matters, then what is the ultimate function of the dynasty? Even if the dynasty has a practical function, the psychological function it used to hold disappears. And to many monarchists, who are monarchists with capital M, that is a risk they're not willing to take in favor of the nation, basically.
Yeah, nationalism, it vests it in principle. I mean, it can only work if it vests sovereignty in the people, i.e., popular sovereignty. And if sovereignty lies anywhere but in the person of the monarch himself, you have to begin to wonder, what is the purpose of the monarchy? If the people are sovereign, if they're entirely capable of executing, promulgating their own laws and justice and things like that, and there really is no purpose for a monarch. There's no purpose for hereditary nobility or any of that. So I will admit that when I started to move towards the reactionary side of things, full disclosure, several years ago, I was much more of a liberal, or maybe even a neoliberal.
Don't worry.
My chest on that one, but when I moved
We
towards the
we were all
reactionary
something
side,
else before what we are today. Carry on.
Yeah, no one in this century is born a monarch. Guess I don't think so. But I realized that nationalism really does take away from what the monarch is, what he embodies in his role, which is to go full James 1 here, the divine right. He's born with the anointing of God, and that's what gives him the right to be the monarch, to rule.
Perhaps we should say the right, but not the knowledge.
Nationalism takes that and gives it to the people.
No, I will keep that quote for me until I die. But yeah, nationalism it is a belief by some monarchists that nationalism directly leads towards republicanism. In fact, depending upon who you ask, nationalism necessarily leads to republicanism, and republicanism necessarily leads to fascism down the line. That for those of us listeners who want to get down that who want to have a working understanding of what accelerationism means, they will get what I mean here. Because the basic issue is that the existence of nationalism and the state proclaiming itself as nationalist, not only has the psychological consequences that Ashen and not only psychological consequences, but also ideological consequences that Ashen mentioned, but you also have this base idea. If the people have a collective identity, it's also much more easier for a collective identity to overthrow the monarch on a base organizational level. Collective identity is a step above in terms of organization versus lack thereof. In fact, if you paid attention so far, it was collective identity that allowed these dynasties to get ahead rather than the absence of it. So the question of whether monarchism is pro or anti-nation is a low-key, very divisive one that many might not be aware. Well, it ultimately, how divisive it is depends on the context. Most Russian monarchists I've met have been, shall we say, of the ultra-nationalist variety that have defended God knows what heinous crimes on the Caucasus, and very few have been of the slightly better pan-Slavist variety. And you also have some German monarchists who really just want Adolf Hitler II, really. No, just slightly better aesthetics, but that's it. And some American monarchists who want the white Anglo-Saxon and Protestant Adolf Hitler II in their white ethno-state, who happens to be a monarchy. That being said, it also they're not all this bad, but it is a question that has to be raised towards most monarchists on where they stand, if with the king or if with the nation.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think one of the issues here as well is that for a lot of sort of early modern political philosophy, especially what you see in Crucius, Leibniz has this to a degree, Hegel's very explicit in this. The monarchy is a kind of organizing principle for the nation. Hegel at one point says this quite clearly. He says that without the people without a monarch are nothing but formless mass, and that basic sort of attitude, I think, informs a lot of modern monarchy, wherein there is a the generalized assumption under, say, in German Empire, Russian Empire, Britain, whatever, is that the monarchy and the nation are cannot exist without one another. And the issue is obviously that online, a kind of position like that, which has a certain level of nuance to it, is very hard to maintain, and it often degenerates. And especially in the kinds of circles that are predisposed to monarchism, or that would be predisposed to becoming monarchists, there can be a sense in which basically you kind of end up choosing like either loyalty to some dynasty, be that whatever that is, or nation. And that itself, I think, is largely an effect of how a lot of movements are structured, how people come into movements, rather than being something intrinsic to monarchism itself. And I think overall it comes down to this question really of if you are to sort of reintroduce a monarchy or to create a monarchy new, what is the principle by which you establish a new dynasty, basically? What is the principle by which you establish some kind of new tradition? And for a lot of people, that, especially sort of Americans that I've seen, that it veers into a kind of rather nasty nationalism more than anything else. As you said, with like Germans wanting Hitler but with a crown, basically, or anything similar, really.
I mean, again, we're not saying that, and as I am mentioned, although we have been painting the question as a black or white one, the truth is that there is a massive degree of nuance that gets missed out on the internet.
Damn nuance, always getting in the way of things.
Yes, why can't we have a simple populistic interpretation for everything in life? Oh, wait, last time we had that, it didn't go well, now did it? But
yeah, I mean, I think, and this is that is the case, and I mean, I think probably America is kind of an easy example because of the lack of a tradition there, but I think in many ways a better example would be Hungary, because for the Hungarian monarchists who are anti-Habsburg, in a certain sense, the creation of a new monarchy with, I don't know, whoever the fuck they want as monarch really is a kind of affirmation of Hungarianness over and above the kinds of things that the Habsburgs really represented, which was basically Catholicism. And it seems to me to be a kind of strange, like Hungarian monarchism to me seems to be quite strange for the simple reason that it seems to be the attempt really to crown this modern, very broken Hungary as some kind of unified thing, rather than being this sort of completely mangled corpse of sort of Hungary prior. And that, I think, is what you can see a lot of the times in discussions about the Balkans in the Russian Empire, or in Russia, sorry, even in like like sort of Chinese monarchism, is that there is this sense in which the monarch is less a principle of unification as a kind of statement of identity on the part of a very embattled group of people, be that Russians or Hungarians or Poles or even East Germans or whatever. And I think that is an interesting. I think it's one of the interesting ways in which monarchism has developed after the death of monarchy, basically. Yeah, in some sense. Obviously, monarchies aren't all destroyed yet, but it does seem to be going that way.
Well, there's a reason some have called modern-day monarchists post-monarchists for a reason. A rare appellation, but it does exist. But I know we're running slightly over time, but we have Ashen here, and he, being an American, perhaps can give an inside perspective and his own takes on American monarchism as a finishing end to today's podcast.
Yeah, certainly. I guess that depends really what you want to know. I think any discussion or comment on American monarchism would be lacking without a mention of my personal favorite Catholic historian and writer, Charles Coulomb. If you want to hire me at Tumblr House, I'm all for it. But he's written a book called Star Spangled Crown that really encapsulates what a lot of American monarchists or idealists that fantasize about traditional government would sort of like to see. It's really an AU history fan fiction, if you will, but it's a very interesting thought exercise in what a 21st century monarch in the United States might look like, or how he might weave together some sort of monarchical mythology out of a staunchly anti-monarchical origin of his nation, and it's fairly convincing the way he does it. But I would just say that me, as an American monarchist, I'm very much in favor of the Caesarean option, as some call it, or the Napoleonic method, as others might call it. Hoping for maybe a well-loved statesman or a military general to stumble upon the perfect storm of civil unrest and stride in gallantly to restore order and receive the accolades of the people, so to speak. But I'm not specifically an American monarchist, because at the end of the day, I think we all understand that that's sort of a fanciful thing to look forward to. But I'm fascinated by monarchy in general. I think it's an effective form of government. I think it's an aesthetic form of government. It's inspiring, and it's worked for far longer than republics have. So I
And we all
advocate
share that
for it
sentiment. And to
whenever
give a
wherever.
bit of hope to all American monarchists who might feel slightly maligned by some of the topics touched here, I would like to remind you the case of the Netherlands. The Netherlands was also founded as an extremely republican nation with an extremely long, at the time, and intense tradition of republicanism and anti-monarchism. And now look at it. One of the shining beacons of European monarchism that still remains. So, never say never. There will always be hope. And this has
And on
been,
that note, I think we can wrap up.
indeed. This has been Monarchism Unfiltered. I've been McCosk.
I've been Bronze.
I've been I am.
And I'm Ashen.